Hello everyone, my name is Adam Bierstedt, and I am currently a prospective PhD student looking at the intersection of Viking Age and medieval Norse culture and modern video games. I am also a content creator here on Twitch under the name Ludo History, analyzing historical games, particularly games that adapt the Nordic Middle Ages, since my MA degree specialized in Viking and medieval Norse studies. That means I'm going to be speaking on this topic both as an academic and as a practitioner of public history, and also means I'm going to be speaking a lot about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. In my paper today, I will be probing at the question, should we care about surface-level accuracy in historical video games? Hopefully, by the end of this, I'll have made a case that yes, we should. If not as a good in and of itself, then because it offers a different way of understanding how people often interact with historical game spaces than a subject-oriented approach does. However, historical video games is an incredibly broad umbrella, and I do only have 20 minutes to speak today. Therefore, I'm going to restrict myself to talking mostly about first or third-person games that attempt to be immersive, that often have role-playing elements, and that make some claim to authentically portray a historical time period. This should call to mind two series, Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed, but my arguments will generally hold true in other genres like management or grand strategy games as well. To some of you watching this, it may seem obvious that we should care about details, like armor or tattoos or buildings. This sort of historical focus, termed object authenticity, is often the default idea of what it means to be a historical game. But there's actually a lot of disagreement among academics and players as to whether or not we should care about this. An informal survey as part of a panel led by Jan Wiener and Sophie Schmidt revealed an approximately 50-50 split on the question of whether, quote, it is important that historical computer and video games show the past as authentically as possible, end quote. Some academics care about historical mechanics, such as Rüdiger Brandis in the brand new volume History in Games, arguing that aesthetic reductions should take a backseat to the ways that games enable authentic experiences through their mechanics, and how they enter the mindsets of past people. Others don't care because if it gets people interested in learning more, which is undeniably a good thing, then it doesn't matter if the surface level details are wrong. As much as it makes for good content to be loudly nitpicking online, it just isn't that productive to air grievances at every little detail a game developer gets wrong. I do not mean to negate these arguments. Subject authenticity is without a doubt important and is underrepresented in general discussions about games. However, I propose that there is a risk of understating the importance of object authenticity as academics. Therefore, I offer counters to each point and offer a further reason to care, based around three observations. First, a material reconstruction intrinsically makes arguments about historical processes. Second, historical games are incredibly, unimaginably popular. And third, caring about material accuracy reveals the diverse ways that players interact with history in games better than a purely subject-oriented approach does. So, part 1, historical process. To start off with, let's play a little game called Spot the Viking. See them? It's really not subtle. This is a screenshot from marketing material for Assassin's Creed Valhalla at the wedding of Oswald of East Anglia, a king we know about from coins minted in his name, and his fictional Danish wife. Two of the nameless NPCs shown here are East Anglian and two are Vikings. It's not exactly hard to tell who's who. In terms of strict material accuracy, this portrayal is obviously untrue. Those pauldrons are absurdly large, and the fact that a Viking can wear furs while the Englishman is wearing a linen tunic shows a very wide temperature disparity. Clothing and armor historically was extremely similar, though not identical, between early English culture and Viking Age Norse culture, and there is no archaeological evidence to suggest tattooing was practiced. These look more like the dwarves in the Hobbit movies than they do historical Vikings. Of course, Assassin's Creed is not actually interested in portraying the past as it was. the franchise's adaptation process is mimetic. In other words, it needs to look sufficiently authentic, with that sufficiency being derived from a mix of popular culture, genuine history, and cool factor. Put a little bit too simply, people wearing ridiculous armor is cool, and if Vikings are anything right now, they're cool. Still, why should we care too much? This is just one instance of a very long tradition of questionable design decisions. Since at least Wagner, and going through Pulp Fiction like Conan the Barbarian, to most recently the television show Vikings, there is a constantly evolving maladaptation of the Viking aesthetic to communicate a kind of otherness to the present. The Vikings are, for better or worse, perceived as fundamentally different than others in their time period and different than we are now. The reason to care, though, is that the many historical inaccuracies, which are popping up on screen now, come from somewhere. To speak to only one, the first DLC for AC Valhalla is set in Ireland, with a druidic cult. The alleged druids wear deer antlers and skulls and live in a swamp, giving clear ties to the horned god Cernunnos and to nature animism. However, this flies in the face of every single scrap of evidence we have for Irish Druidism, as they were instead lawkeepers, sorcerers, and poets, deeply and thoroughly socialized and respected. They have no link to Cernunnos, who was not worshipped in Ireland and is not even a nature deity probably, and were in fact legally forbidden from the types of clothes that they wear in the game and in this marketing screenshot. The image of the druid as a nature guardian cult figure is a result of the 19th century. Itself a misreading of classical sources, the deer-antlered nature guardian is a romantic, eco-nationally focused imposition by the English on the Irish. Ireland, as the last outcropping of Celtic culture, was thought to must have these beings that are tied to ancient places in the landscape, representing a desirable, uncorrupted primitivism. While Assassin's Creed Valhalla does not intend this link, I think, it cannot portray the druids in the way that it does without hearkening to this history. Tobias Vinnerling argues that games do not attempt to justify themselves, and cannot be read like historical texts. This is, I think, true. However, that does not mean that justifications do not exist, and that justifications cannot be effectively imposed on games. And it is within those justifications that we find the reflections of our own culture, historical arguments that too often reflect outdated or downright problematic appropriations of the past. Vikings are often burly, blonde warriors, the stereotypical Übermensch. Pseudoscientific, proto-fascist scholarship from the 19th and early 20th centuries are reproduced in games, even those not about World War II or about fascism, even as scholarship disproves that prior research. Yet again, the Vikings were incredibly diverse and did not look anything like we imagine them to. An object-authentic focus, just as much as a proceduralist one, makes historiographical arguments that cannot and should not be neglected in rigorous methods of analyzing games. Part 2. Popularity. Assassin's Creed markets itself as historically accurate, leading to this dreaded headline: "Explore the era of Vikings and lead your people through the Dark Ages to victory." There's just two tiny problems. Well, the Dark Ages is a construct that implies a dismal, uncultured, disconnected world that has absolutely no relationship to actual 9th century history. And no, they are not Dark Ages because we have no sources for them either. That's equally untrue. And second, whatever Ubisoft created looks nothing like the Viking Age. Gargantuan longhouses sit alongside ruined stone castles, while men wielding greatswords duel in chaotic battlefields peppered with gunpowder explosions. The aesthetic that emerges is a mishmash of medieval types from an entire continent and 500 years of history, an egregiously bad representation of the Viking Age to anyone who has read even popular books on the subject. But Assassin's Creed Valhalla will almost certainly be more popular than any book on the Vikings. The Assassin's Creed franchise to date has sold over 120 million copies across all of its entries. While it's much harder to get sales numbers for academic books, even the most successful ones tend to number in the thousands, not the millions. Therefore, the exceptionally distorted view of history showcased here in the game is the only engagement that many players will have with the historical time period. And because Assassin's Creed markets itself so aggressively as historical, people will and do believe it. This serves to reinforce the popular conceptions that the game itself draws on, a mechanism described here by Rolf Knorr. It is frustrating as someone who does public history to have to, and be expected to, focus on critiquing realism, meaning surface-level object authenticity, instead of being able to talk about more interesting subject-authentic historical experiences. While academics writing for other academics know how to, and to, talk about subject-authentic experiences first, academics writing for the general public don't have that luxury until after doing a vaguely defined sufficient amount of nitpicking historical errors. While it is good to get more people excited about history, breaking increasingly entrenched pop cultural visualizations and as a result narratives is something that popular video game series can easily and persuasively challenge, and they choose not to very often. I can't go so far as to say that there is a moral responsibility for game designers to do so. After all, games are meant to entertain first and educate second. But given that so many game studios, including Ubisoft, use historical advisors and museum pieces as a way to grant authority to their game's depiction of the past, it is not far-fetched to ask designers to engage more thoughtfully in what pieces of popular conception they actually draw on and make manifest. Part 3. Engagement. This manifestation is something I want to dwell a little bit more on. Video games construct a virtual space that is in some way a more fun representation of the past, but one that is still quasi-physical within the game world's space. Franchises such as Assassin's Creed offer a, quote, core fantasy that is in some way designed to be a more enjoyable version of history than history itself is. Scholars of historical video games often cite Jean Baudrillard's concept of a hyperreality to describe video games, which is to me an eminently useful framework. Adam Chapman and Felix Zimmermann, among others, have also linked games to heritage tourism sites, something that I think is useful and do myself. I'm not saying anything new, therefore, by proposing a comparison to historical tourism, but such a framework has interesting consequences when we take an object-authentic approach. A spatial syntax analysis of museum visitors suggests that most people who visit museums don't really engage with the history. Most glance at the objects, accept that they represent some past or some culture, and then move on to larger, more famous objects without reading the placards that provide historical contexts. At heritage sites, there is a desire to walk in the steps of some past person, to imagine their struggles, their successes, and their awe, but not to learn about the reality where it challenges this imagination. As such, the popular cultural memory of past times ends up being extremely flimsy, clustered in a few objects or practices. What this means is that the rest of the past is malleable. The living history museums of Jorvik and Lansau Meadows, shown here, manipulate the image of the medieval to not require most of the stereotypes of filthy peasants and looming stone castles that we see so often in medieval video games, for instance. So, let's turn again to this image of how the games reinforce popular imaginings. Games draw an idea of the past, and in turn, through their portrayal, reinforce it. However, the idea that games draw on is much more malleable than many designers appear to think it is. There is no deep-seated popular cultural memory. There is only a constant negotiation between experts, interested amateurs, and the broad media that most people draw on. My current PhD proposal tries to examine within a Viking context exactly how deep this cultural memory actually goes. My suggestion is not very far at all. To be blunt, many people who will play AC Valhalla would not be turned off by the absence of stone castles. They don't know or care one way or another, as long as the game looks photorealistic and enables the fantasy of raiding like in the TV show. Naturally, this means that not everything still can or should be faithfully recreated. However, it suggests that game designers in this type of game can cater to a narrower audience who will recognize and appreciate a better reconstruction of past objects and aesthetics without alienating the broader base. Ubisoft already does this in fact. Some weapons and wax bowls in Assassin's Creed Valhalla are based on museum pieces, though the wax bowl is based on a coin rather than an actual seal. I am therefore simply advocating for doing more of the same thing as is already being done. When in doubt, you should err towards the side of a better reconstruction rather than a worse one. In sum, I have offered 3 reasons to care about accuracy in the most traditional sense of the term when it comes to historical video games. First, the inaccurate depictions within games come from an often problematic historiography, and players and scholars cannot move past that historiography without acknowledging and challenging it. Secondly, games are far and away more popular than the most popular academic work on the subject, and people believe claims to accuracy to the point where public history work is embroiled entirely in object-oriented critiques instead of far more interesting subject-oriented ones. Thirdly, players engage with video games much like they do with heritage sites and museums. Because they are seeking some kind of meaningful experience, apart from a small handful of expected tropes for any given time period, there is a lot of room for increased accuracy without making history boring or unimmersive. Therefore, game designers should err towards the side of making something more accurate, not less. There is such a thing as caring too much though, and I'm not advocating for that. Ragging on a game for using the wrong sandals for a Roman legionnaire or the wrong uniforms in World War I doesn't actually engage in interesting historical arguments. After all, even game developers that try to be accurate must negotiate between popular perceptions, historical reality, and the practical limitations of a research budget and development cycle. And that doesn't even touch on games that are stylized in such a way as to completely sidestep the issue of reconstruction. For instance, Pendragon shown here, a game that John Ingold is speaking on at this very conference. Nor am I suggesting that reconstructing the material form of history should take precedence over what Tara Copplestone terms constructionist and deconstructionist histories. Getting the uniforms right does not automatically make a game interesting or good from a historical lens. There is enough room in discussions of the medium to care about multiple approaches to history, and using a variety of methodologies to explore all 3 of the types here is good. Instead, what I will leave us with is the reminder that, as contradictory as it may seem, very little about the past is set in stone. Games have a lot of power to shape historical imaginations and narratives, and thoughtfully engaging with every manifestation of that power as a designer, as a player, and as an academic makes the past more complex, more interesting, and therefore more enjoyable for all of us. Thank you very much for listening.